Today, we're thrilled to be joined by Jeff Harmening, Chairman and CEO of General Mills and Chairman of the Consumer Brands Association. Jeff and I will be discussing how he has chosen to lead during the pandemic and other current events happening in the world today. Specifically, we'll touch on Jeff's background, his leadership style and experiences, how General Mills has navigated workforce and business operations hurdles, the changing landscape of consumer behavior, and ending with a discussion focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion. We'll reserve a little time at the end of the session for audience Q&A. Please submit questions at any time using the Q&A panel at the bottom of the screen. I'd like to thank General Mills for their sponsorship of today's session. Let's get started by turning it over to Jeff for some brief opening remarks. Jeff, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, Jeff, thanks for having me. And I guess I'd just like to start by saying I feel a little pressure kicking off the inaugural discussion here, the Consumer Brands Association and CEO series. But I am really proud of the work that the CBA has done over the last number of months, especially in COVID-19. And, having pivoted the organization to talk about things that consumers really care about and advocate for policies and smart regulations that will benefit consumers, I think has made a big difference. So I'm happy to be here talking about General Mills and a part of the Consumer Brands Association.
Well, great. Thank you. We're thrilled to have you on board, thrilled with your chairmanship, and we too are excited about this series and excited to work together. Why don't we get started by talking a little bit about your background, your history with General Mills, your history in the broader CPG business.
So I'm a 25-year veteran of General Mills, so I've seen quite a bit in the CPG space. I've never seen a global pandemic, but I've seen quite a bit in the CPG space, and most of that time has been in the marketing organization and in general management positions, both here in the United States and around the world. I've spent 7 years in Switzerland, helping run the joint venture between General Mills and Nestle, cereal partners worldwide, as well as a career that spans across a lot of different businesses here in the U.S. I started my career actually in finance and realized pretty quickly that marketing would be my calling and not finance. But I've really been privileged to be a part of a company like General Mills for such a long period of time.
You've been the CEO since?
I've been the CEO since June of 2017. So it's been about 3 years, and people ask me whether it's gone by quickly. And what I tell them, it's kind of like when your kids are young, the days are long and the years are short, and never so is a bit more true than the last 4 months or so.
So what does, leading General Mills for the past 3 years, but obviously with the company for some time, what does the morning routine look like? How do you get ready for leadership? You have 3,500 people in your office there. How do you get ready to be a leader every day?
Well, I think for me, it's important. The first, I think I would say I'm carrying on a legacy. General Mills is a 155-year-old company, and with a lot of great leaders before it, the 44th oldest company on the New York Stock Exchange. And so I feel a tremendous sense of responsibility to the people of General Mills and the consumers we serve. And as far as getting ready in the morning, I think the most important thing that I've been able to do is assemble a great team, a great leadership team. And for me, leadership is about setting tone, about setting strategy, about picking the right people, and then also making sure there's room for everybody to do what they do really well, because we have a lot of people who are highly skilled. And so when I get up in the morning, it's a matter of setting the direction, but also making sure I rely on our team.
I've met that team. I've worked with a lot of people on that team. I agree with you. It's been a pleasure to work with them. They are a strong team. And I imagine when you get into crisis situations like this, it makes it a heck of a lot easier knowing that you can lean on them as we go through this. Talk a little bit about who's influenced you over the years, past, present, currently. Where do you look towards for some of that leadership influence?
I think one of the biggest influences in my life certainly have been my parents, and probably first and foremost my mom, who was kind of an executive before her time. And I watched her climb the ladder of her company. She's got her doctorate and in higher education administration, was a hospital administrator. And I watched her and how talented she was, but also the struggles that she faced. And so I think we'll talk later probably a little bit about racism in the U.S. maybe, and a little bit about inclusion. But I watched my mom battle perceptions that women couldn't do the job as well as men. And knowing my mom, she's pretty tenacious and pretty talented. And, she fought through a lot in order to accomplish what she did. And so I learned a lot from her about the value of having everyone contribute on the team, no matter their gender or sexual orientation or race. And I learned a lot from her, but I also learned a lot from my dad, who was a college professor and has always thought my mom was the greatest thing ever, and supported her in her endeavors. And he was never afraid to have her take the fore on things. And so, having watched them, they're probably the two of the biggest influences in my career.
And a mom who has a doctorate, a dad who was a college professor, you're the CEO of General Mills, your brother is tremendously successful. You guys have really been a disappointing family here.
Yeah, my brother's an executive of Huntington Bank, and he and I are very close. And he's a terrific leader and runs their retail business. And my mom was a professor for a while, as my dad. I say they're kind of disappointed their kids got into business, but that's not really the case. They're proud parents, but what's interesting, someone said your parents must be proud of what you achieve, and what their response is, usually my dad has said, yeah, I'm proud of what they've achieved professionally, but I'm actually more proud that they're good husbands and fathers.
That's great. That's great. And we'll get into some of the things later, I think, that they're extremely proud of too, which is how General Mills and you have handled the tough situation in Minneapolis in recent weeks. But before we get there, let's continue along the lines of leadership, your approach to leadership, how you would summarize, I think, your 3 characteristics that best describe your approach to leadership.
Well, for me, the most important characteristic of leadership, and certainly one I hope I have, is authenticity. And I think authenticity is important. And people are authentic in different ways, so that doesn't mean that everybody needs to be the same. But authenticity is important because that's the currency of trust. And you only follow people who you trust, no matter what their ideology. And so I remember one time, probably about 5 years ago, I was at General Mills. I'd just done a presentation up on stage in front of the whole company, and an administrative assistant with whom I had worked a number of years came up to me and said, Jeff, I want to let you know something. I want to tell you what I like about you. And I said, please tell me more. I get all kinds of feedback. I love to hear more about, something that you like. And she said, when I see you up on stage and when I talk to you one-on-one, or when I see you in a meeting, you're always the same guy. There's not a stage Jeff Harmening and a meeting Jeff Harmening and a one-on-one. She said, that's what I like about you. And no matter when I talk to you, I feel like I'm hearing the same person. And so I think the first and probably one of the most important hallmarks of any good leader is going to be authenticity. The second, I guess I would say, is clarity. And I think that's particularly important in the times we're in now, because so many people want certainty. And when you're facing a global pandemic, or when you're dealing with issues that are deep and longstanding, like systematic racism, it's really hard to have certainty. But what you can have is clarity. And so, recently we issued our fourth quarter results, and of course, investors and analysts wanted us to issue guidance, which we didn't do, because I think it could leave a false sense of security on what is certain. But what we did was be clear about what we're trying to accomplish. And so I think that's probably another hallmark of my leadership, and something I think is important. And then the third, we touched on it a little bit earlier, but that's teamwork, and the value of team building and bringing a group of people together to accomplish something that none of you could accomplish on your own. I grew up in Southern Indiana. I was fortunate enough to watch Larry Bird play basketball at Indiana State. And although he is, one of the greatest basketball players of all time, the reason they went to the Final Four was not only because of Larry Bird, but because of the talent he had around them. They had a point guard who could run the show. They had a shooting guard who was a great scorer. They had a power forward who couldn't hit a 15-foot jump shot if his life depended on it, but he got every rebound. And they had another guy who could defend anybody on the court. And so the 5 of them were much better than any one of them could be. And I think that's the same. Business is a team sport, and you're only good as the team can work together. And I guess I'd like to think that I have the ability to get the most out of a team.
You are dating yourself with Larry Bird and Indiana State references.
I was in 8th grade and loved watching the Sycamores up until the final game.
You said before, you've been at General Mills a long time. You've worked for some great leaders. You'd never seen a pandemic before, and that doesn't make you unique. What does make you unique from many companies is you were doing business in China, however. And as a multinational company, you did have a little bit of a head start on what was coming with COVID. How did that prepare you? What did you see in China? How did you implement some lessons learned from that? And how do you think you got a head start on what we're dealing with in the U.S.?
Yeah, so we've got a good business in China. Half of it's away from home with Haagen-Dazs shops, and the other half is a dumpling company, a business called Wanchai Ferry Frozen Dumplings, which is an at-home business. I think, we got a lot of learnings from China. The first lesson we learned is that we actually could do business during a pandemic, and I think that was important, but that we had to act a little bit differently. And for us, that meant at our factories was implementing temperature checks and masks and social distancing and all the things that are required in order to run a successful manufacturing operation. And we did that without a single case of COVID-19. But we took all the precautions. We spent a lot of money doing it, but one of the reasons we were able to do well in China despite the pandemic was because we took all those precautions. The other thing that we did was, for our office workers, we had them work from home, almost immediately. And interestingly, they found new ways of working, and they innovated and they coordinated amongst themselves, and they were glad the company was taking care of them. And so we learned some important steps there. And one of the things that it caused us to do, as we saw that unfolding in January and early February, we put a global COVID-19 task force together to make sure that we would have consistent approaches and policies around the globe, even if the pandemic took different courses in different places, or even if governments took different courses. At least it gave us a framework and a group of people who could make sure that we were taking care of our employees and our communities and our consumers in the same way everywhere.
So a company that's been through depressions, it's been through world wars, it's been through political conflicts and many other crises, obviously still learning some new lessons here during this situation. What aspects of what you've learned through COVID do you think become permanent within the company, or at least change the course of the company?
Yeah, so General Mills is a 155-year-old company, formed on the banks of the Mississippi River in 1866, and it's been through all the things that you said. In fact, I went back and found news clippings from the intercompany newsletter that was published in 1918. It was talking about all the precautions to take during a pandemic, like washing your hands and masks and social distancing. Literally the same thing 100 years later. The first thing I would say about looking at all of our history was that we're still here. And, it gives hope that there is another side of this. And I think that's important. But, more importantly, as a company, we've actually performed as well or better than we did before COVID. And I think the reason for that is that first, we were very clear that we were taking care of our employees first. And we put a number of policies and measures in place to take care of our employees, whether they're at manufacturing plants or whether they're working in offices. We took care of the community. We made a lot of food donations instead of shutting down food service lines. In many cases, we made food and donated it to people who really needed it. And in the course of doing that, ended up taking care of our shareholders. And we did all of that with a focus on our purpose, our company purpose. And we talk about making food the world loves, but in the last 4 months, we've made the food the world needs. And so have many of the people we would normally consider competitors. I'm really proud of our industry in aggregate. I think we've really distinguished ourselves in how we've operated. One of the things that we have learned is that as any big company, we have a lot of internal meetings. I'm sure those listening, if you're a part of a big company, you don't know what I'm talking about, but we have a lot of internal meetings. And, one of the things we found working remotely, we had a lot fewer internal meetings and spent a lot less time talking to ourselves and a lot more time focusing on the problems of the day and focusing on how to meet the needs of the consumer, focusing on how to work with our suppliers, focusing on how to work with our retail customers. And so one of the things that we have learned that I think will stay with us is that, as one of my members of my leadership team likes to say, the game is played on the outside, not the inside. And a lot of big companies, you can play the game on the inside and you don't do as well. So that's one of the things we learned. And as a result, we have moved faster than probably we ever have before.
You mentioned making food the world needs, a little bit of a change there, at least in the perspective. Throughout this crisis, I think many in the industry realized we're essential, right? I mean, this is kind of an industry taken for granted. No, we are essential and deemed essential by the government and proven its essential nature day in and day out. Has that led to, as you've seen with your team members, greater pride in the work they do? I know you gave people the option who may have been in your headquarters to go out and work in some of the manufacturing facilities. How has it changed people within the company?
People are enormously proud of what we've been able to do. And I think the people who are the most proud are the people who are making the product every day. And, we put in place measures to keep them safe, like temperature checks and masks and social distancing. And we had COVID policies and all that. And so people in manufacturing and logistics know we've had their back. But I think the thing that kept them coming in every day the most of all was the pride and that they were doing something that was critical. And as a to put some facts around that, 98% of our manufacturing and logistics employees showed up every day during the pandemic. 98%. That's higher than the number of people who show up when we don't have a pandemic. And we do engagement scores across our company, and our engagement scores are really, really high because people know that we're doing something important, and they know that we are taking care of them in a way and looking out for them in a way that's differential. And there's been a lot of talk recently about stakeholder involvement and engagement, about doing right for stakeholders is right for shareholders. I think for us, we proved that during this last quarter, that's absolutely true. When you take care of your employees, when you take care of your community, when you look after each other, when you serve your consumers, your shareholders also win.
So in the midst of a pandemic, your other priorities didn't go away, whether it's around innovation, new products, sustainability. How have you helped the team juggle a focus on those priorities while navigating a once-in-a-lifetime situation?
Well, first of all, leaders cast a long shadow, and the things that are important to you as a leader become important to the organization. And so it's important that we did the day-to-day, but it's also important that we keep innovating and keep meeting the demands of our consumers. And so everyone internally knows that continuing to innovate, and whether that's innovation on how we do work, or that's innovation on what we bring to the marketplace, or innovation on how we work with our customers, all those types of innovations were deemed important. And everybody knew that those were important. And our goal is to come out of the pandemic stronger than we went in. And so people know that innovation of all those types leads to that. When it comes to sustainability, that's been very easy. I mean, because General Mills have been recognized as a leader in sustainability for a long time, long before I became the CEO. And the issues we have with plastics, the issues we have with our recycling system, the issue we have with CO2 emissions, the issue we have with topsoil being eroded, those aren't going away because we have a pandemic. And so we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And if walking is the day-to-day execution of the pandemic, then the chewing gum piece are all the other things, including innovation and sustainability. And so we haven't taken our eye off the ball on any of those things, even if that's not what gets the press clippings right now. And for us, we don't do the things we do to earn notoriety. We do the things we do to make sure that we leave the world a better place, and to make sure that we take care of all of our stakeholders.
I'm going to transition a little bit. You mentioned a moment ago kind of lessons learned over the last quarter, the experience of the last quarter. The last quarter was pretty good. You just announced a couple weeks ago that sales were up 20%. How much of that is sustainable?
I think some of it's going to be sustainable, and for a period of time, but certainly not all of it. The reason we're up 20% is, yes, our categories grew, but it was fundamentally because we were doing some things differently as well. As we look ahead, at-home consumption has grown significantly. I think at-home consumption will be elevated for a period of time, especially when it comes to food. And even after the pandemic has run its course, which I think is going to be a little while from now, but even after the pandemic has run its course, I think we're still going to be faced with an economy that's going to be really challenged in a time of recession. And people tend to eat more food at home during recessionary periods than they do in other periods. And so I think food from home is going to be elevated. In particular, one of the things that we have found is that people have rediscovered the joy of baking. And our baking categories are way up. And whether it's Gold Medal flour, or whether that's Betty Crocker desserts or Pillsbury refrigerated dough, it sounds trite, but people have really found that the kitchen is the heart of the home. And I would say in particular baking, and people are baking like crazy. And in a world where so much around them is unknowable and so much is changing, whether it's the landscape on race or whether it's the global health pandemic, people yearn for some certainty and yearn for something they can count on. And for us and for a lot of people in our industry, it's our brands that they count on. They go back to the brands that they know and trust. And what we see is that, household penetration of our brands has gone way up. Our repeat rates are pretty good. And so I can't say for sure how much of the demand is going to stick. I think that some of it will, because I think consumers have found something in some cases that wasn't there before. But we have to do our job to make sure that we maintain that, which is why we maintain our marketing spending, which is why we offer consumers help on our BettyCrocker.com and Pillsbury.com websites. Our traffic on those websites is up more than 100%.
Wow. Well, I know when my 13-year-old son is baking, something big has happened. The world has changed. What aspects of lessons learned over the last quarter do you think perhaps fundamentally change aspects of your business, whether it's SKU rationalization, other efficiencies you may have achieved within manufacturing facilities? You mentioned before when you were talking about meetings that now, there's fewer of those. People are getting things done. What else here do you think has the potential to make the business more efficient and successful for the long run?
Well, I think what we've proved to ourselves internal. I'll talk about internally, then I'll talk about the external landscape. Internally, I think we've proven that there are a lot of different ways to work, and what's efficient for some people may not be efficient for other people. And so I hear people talking about going back to normal. I think we're going to go back to a new normal, where people realize that a lot of their job they can do away from home, but some of it they can't, and some of it they need to collaborate in an office space. And so I think the future is going to look like a new normal, not the normal that we just exited. In terms of the external landscape, one of the things that's very clear is that consumers are relying on e-commerce more and more. And that trend has really gone through the roof, especially as it relates to food. And we see that in China, we see that in Europe, we certainly see that in the US, and that's a trend that is not going to go away. And that has implications because, roughly 85% of our business that we do through e-commerce actually goes through a grocery store first. And people talk about direct delivery and pure play e-commerce players, but 85% of our e-commerce business goes through grocery stores. And I think that'll have an implication because when you think about that environment, there'll probably be fewer SKUs in the shelf and more facings of SKUs that are fast turning. And so there will be some SKU rationalization, which is the continuation of a trend and the acceleration of a trend that's already started. I think we're well positioned for that, but I think a year from now, that's what we'll see a continued growth in e-commerce and a few fewer SKUs in the shelf and more facings of things that our retailers can count on to turn.
I'm going to switch subjects completely. Obviously, none of us are going to forget 2020. We're only 6 months in. It's amazing when you watch the videos of the things that have already happened in 2020. It's hard to believe, and we haven't even gotten to an election later this year and everything else that's going to happen. So it's already been a complex year, and you throw on top of that a massive and justifiable focus on equity, on diversity, on inclusion. In early June, the spotlight was on Minnesota, Minneapolis specifically, where you're based, after the killing of George Floyd. Can you share more about that experience, how it impacted you as a leader?
Yeah, it was. It's been a tough experience, and it's been tough to watch a city you love kind of torn apart by this. But it's the fact of it is that what we see with George Floyd is not a new problem. It's a problem that's existed for a while, and frankly, it's not a Minneapolis problem. As demonstrated by demonstrations around the U.S. and around the world. When you talk about systematic racism, it's existed here in the U.S. for 400 years, and it's just come to light. And as a leader, it certainly caused me to reflect. We have a very diverse board that I'm proud of. We have a very diverse leadership team in all aspects, and we pride ourselves on being an inclusive workforce, and we've done a lot over a number of years. But what it's really done for me as a leader is open my eyes to the challenges before us. And it's more than one just, police officer who maybe didn't do what he was supposed to be doing. It didn't do what he was supposed to be doing. And so, it opened my eyes to the systematic changes we have to make in policing and education and healthcare. And there's a lot of work ahead of us. And as proud as I am of what General Mills has done over the last few decades, it's very clear there's more that we need to do, and we need to be a part of that solution, not only General Mills, but business in general.
Following the death of George Floyd, General Mills announced 5 areas that you would be focused on in terms of injustice and what you could do to push against that. Can you talk a little bit about those 5 areas and how you decided on those areas of focus?
Yeah, sure. So as we think about our response, I mean, first, if you're dealing with something as complex as systematic racism, as a long-lived, the first thing you have to do is that you have to realize that the answers are not only going to be immediate; they're going to be longer term, but that you also need to have some immediate progress, and you need to meet an immediate need while also playing the long game. And so, as we think about the areas that we have participated in, you said there are 5. I mean, the first is immediate relief. And specifically in the area of food pop-up pantries here in the Twin Cities. The other area, I guess, would be recovery. And when you see buildings burned out in the Twin Cities, you realize that you really need to show progress against the recovery efforts. And so we've donated time and money and energy to help start the recovery efforts in the Twin Cities, the physical recovery. The third is convening. I would say really engaging with other businesses here in the Twin Cities. General Mills has a long history with inclusivity efforts. And it's interesting, as a company back in 1878, the mill exploded, the General Mills mill exploded. And one of the things that came out of that was greater safety for flour mills, because flour mills were very dangerous places. And the founder of General Mills, Cadwallader Washburn, shared the safety technology with the entire industry, because he felt it was important that everybody be safe. The same would be true of how we feel about our inclusivity efforts, that we don't think that's proprietary. In fact, to the extent that we can share with what we've learned with other companies and also learn from other companies, we think that that's going to be important. So we've really worked on convening more than 100 businesses here in the Twin Cities to start to address the issues in front of us, and then partnering. And I think this partnering piece is important, because business can't solve racism alone, neither can government, neither can community leaders. It has to be a combined effort. And so we have really been partnering with others in the community, whether it's community leaders, politicians, other businesses, and then finally lending our voice to policy support. We're not going to General Mills is not going to recreate police policy, but we can lend our voice along with others in the Twin Cities to make sure that we see police reform. We've done that. We've done the same thing with education reform. So those are the 5 areas that we have engaged in. And again, we're in it for the long haul, but we also realize that we also need to make sure we get some quick wins, and we show quick action, because I think that's necessary as well, to see people not only hear what we think, but also see what we do.
Well, I know your sincerity on this topic. We've talked about it a lot, and your point about being in it for the long haul, I think, is important. You recognize that this isn't a one-off situation. This isn't for anyone in our industry, a PR exercise. This is a long-term commitment. And I think some of that is demonstrated when you look at the iconic brands that make up this industry. We've all seen the coverage, whether it's Aunt Jemima or Uncle Ben's, others that need to be revisited. What is the role of brands in terms of fighting injustice, inequality that we're seeing, the type of injustice and inequality we're seeing in the country today? What is our role as an industry?
Well, I think as we think about it, there's a role for brands themselves, and I think there's a role for what goes into the brands. So, for the brands themselves, I mean, the first thing, authenticity, I talked about, important for leadership. It's also important for a brand. For brands to speak up on topics of race or health or something else, you can't really just show up to the party right when something happens. You have to have a history of it. And so there are brands that we have, like Wheaties, for example, where we have highlighted this the breakfast of champions, and we've highlighted Black champions as well as white champions. And so Wheaties as a platform is a good one to talk about racial injustice. The same with Cheerios, where we've been a very inclusive brand for a long period of time. And so there is a role for brands, but you've got to do it in an authentic way. And you have to do it in a sustained way over a period of time. It can't be, you're just going to show up to the party now with a message for everyone. equally, what goes into the brands is important. But and what I mean by that is the suppliers who make our brands possible, and whether those are suppliers that supply ingredients or whether those are suppliers for communication, making sure that the people who supply our brands and supply our industry, that we have as diverse a population of suppliers as possible, because nothing gets people out of a current system like economic justice. And so for us, we're very focused on making sure that our supplier base represents the people we serve as well. And whether that's advertising or whether that's the ingredients.
That's great. Thank you. Let me take a second, invite people to submit questions if they have them. I know there's a Q&A on the bottom of the screen. We have several questions that have been submitted. One of them is, hindsight's 2020. Looking back, isn't ironic, here we are 2020. Looking back on the first 6 months of this year, both, I think, COVID as well as the social issues. In hindsight, what would you have done different? What would you have done different leading up to this year? But even within the moment, what lessons have you learned?
I think certainly we moved pretty fast. We moved starting in February and addressing what we thought was going to happen around the world with COVID. I certainly would have started in January instead of February. So starting even earlier would have been helpful. One of the big lessons I take away from what we have done is just the value of communication. And I didn't touch on that earlier, but I have communicated as a leader more than I ever have, and to our organization and throughout the industry. And so to our organization, I've done weekly videos, and I've just thought it important that people hear my voice in a time of uncertainty as a leader, and kind of where I'm taking us and what we're seeing and what we're doing and how we're behaving and how we're thinking. And as I reflect on that, that's something I'll continue to do as we go forward is to communicate more frequently, because it's important to keep everybody on the same page, especially in times of great uncertainty. And so keeping that voice alive. And I think also just the external voice. One of the things that this has shown me is that, the importance of our industry, and whether that's talking on MSNBC or CNBC or CNN or Fox Business News or whatever the outlet, that we as an industry have an important voice, and so does General Mills. And we need to make sure that we have that voice heard. And it's important that people hear our voice.
So speaking of an industry, how have you seen the industry perhaps work together in a moment like this that is different than maybe they hadn't worked together before the crisis? How has Consumer Brands been helpful to you and your team during this crisis?
Yeah, I'm proud of our entire industry, the entire CPG industry, and I really do mean that. And it's easy to say, we compete with certain companies on a day-to-day basis, but when you get in pandemic, you're just trying to make sure you get everything to market. And I've been really impressed by the values within the CPG industry, whether it's healthcare products or whether it's food products. I've also seen better integration along our supply chain, better relationships with our retail customers, better communication with them. The same would be true of our supplier base, and so more frequent communications and better communications. And so I think as an industry, we'll come out of this stronger. I started at the top of this with kind of an unpaid ad for the Consumer Brands Association, what you all have done, but to watch what the Consumer Brands Association has done with policymakers is more than any one company could have done on its own, which is the value of the Consumer Brands Association, and bringing different groups together, whether they're government policymakers or people who influence policymakers or other associations. And the fact that you've been willing to work with other associations, I think it shows the value of collective action. And I've really been impressed with your team, and not only the activities they've undergone, but more importantly, the progress that they've made.
Well, I think you hit it on the head in terms of the role of an association that comes through in a crisis, do for the industry what no single company can do for itself. And the crisis certainly gave us ample opportunities to do that. And we too have learned a lot of good lessons now about how we apply that going forward. Let me ask you, I've got a couple other questions that get into the business side, some of the marketing trends here, e-commerce obviously being a bigger driver than perhaps it was in the past. Are you looking to change some of your approaches in this area from a marketing standpoint, pricing initiatives and other things, given some of the new trends that we're seeing?
Well, I think that, as I said, the biggest change will be on the e-commerce front, and we've been investing in e-commerce for a number of years, and so it's not as if we woke up today and said, "Hey, I think e-commerce is going to be big someday." But I think continuing to invest in our capabilities in e-commerce, particularly in the data and analytics area, is going to be important. Because even if it's still a relatively small part of our business, I think it's going to become bigger over time, and continuing to invest in that area is going to be important. When it comes to brand marketing, I think what this pandemic shows is that we need to be in the business of solving real consumer problems, and not ones that are made up on our own minds or ones that we think would be interesting, but what are consumers really interested in, and so we've changed our approach to. I talked about baking earlier, but instead of having really, really intricate, fancy things that people could do with their baking items, there are a lot of people recently who have found gold medal in the flour in their cabinet for the first time, and they kind of don't know what to do with it. And so making sure that we are helping solve some of the basic needs of things they have in their pantry has become increasingly important. And I guess those would be probably the two areas on the marketing messaging side, making sure that our messaging fits the time, and then with regard to e-commerce, making sure that we stay on that trend, because it's not a fad, it's a trend. I think it's going to continue to accelerate.
So let me close with one last question. You mentioned your 3 leadership attributes. You didn't mention resiliency. I've got to imagine, though, resiliency is a part of any good leader. How much of that do you get just from being a Minnesota Vikings fan?
I get a double dose of that, Jeff. Thank you for asking. I get a double dose. I am a Minnesota Vikings fan. I'm also a huge Chicago Cubs baseball fan. So, if you're, what that tells you is, you got to be resilient and you have to be loyal. And so I feel like I've gotten a double dose of that. I actually gain a lot of energy from our team, and watching how well they performed over the last few months. And but it does take resiliency, and we're going to be in this pandemic for a while. This is not going to leave us tomorrow or the day after, and we can't just wish it away. And so we have to learn to live with it and make the best of it.
I'm going to close there. We want to keep these tight. We want people, people have got other work to do. We also know they don't want to spend all day in a video conference. So I'm going to close there. I want to thank you. I'm seeing a bunch of great comments. People really appreciate your candor and your counsel. So thank you to you. Thank you to the General Mills team for their support and for sponsoring this. A big thank you to PwC as well for their support. For those in the audience, I'd like to encourage you to sign up again as we do this. Our next session is July 29th at 1 p.m., where we'll be joined by Al Williams, CEO of Bush Brothers, Drew Facer, CEO of Idahoan, and Riles McMullen, CEO of Flowers Foods, all talking about maneuvering food companies during a pandemic. We think that will be insightful because of their experiences, just like yours, Jeff. So thank you for that. We appreciate everyone's participation, and we look forward to continuing these discussions throughout the remainder of the year. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me here, and I look forward to learning from everybody else.
Good. All right, take care.
All right, thank you.